Good morning, good afternoon. We're having a conversation on what role India plays in the world order and against the backdrop of all the changes that we're seeing, how a country which has clear ambitions can navigate an ever-changing environment. And let me go back a few years to the 2010s when India came out with the idea that it has to become one of the shapers of the New World Order. And there have been several books about this. We've been to conferences, we've read articles. But how could you sum up the ambition of India as the most populous country on earth at the moment?
No, I mean, so India is interesting because it is a growing economy. It's one of the fastest growing G20 economies. It is currently the fourth largest economy. Soon will surpass Germany to be the third. But I think the reality is that this is a world where India, despite its impressive growth over the past 20, 25 years, very elimination of poverty, very impressive in many ways, has been overshadowed by China's rise. And China being a major international power right at India's doorstep, with which India has a very long-standing border dispute, which occasionally flares up into violent confrontation as well. So this is the world in some ways that India has to navigate over the next 10, 20 years, which is, in some ways, by most measures, the third most capable country in the world. It has an independent nuclear deterrent. It has a very large standing military. It has international economic interests now. Like I travel to Latin America and the South Pacific, and you find like Indian investment in these places, Indian businesses, Indian trade. But how does a country that is a developing economy, fast-growing, third largest economy in the world, but still very much behind the United States and China in most respects, how does that country navigate its way in the international system? And the short answer, I think, is one, by building up its own capabilities. That's obviously, I think, the number one priority. Two, I think there's actually a lot in India's own neighborhood. It's a very volatile neighborhood, and we've had quite sweeping political changes in Nepal and Bangladesh just in the last 2 years, like two neighbors. Maintaining a balance of power in the broad region, particularly with an eye on China. I think managing very difficult problems in the Middle East, which is quite close by, and questions of counterterrorism, which have domestic repercussions for India. And finally, reshaping the international order in a way, in a few different ways. One is reforming existing institutions. So India has been proposing, whether it's at the United Nations or at international financial institutions, to building up its own new institutions as well. So India has been quite active in that respect. And then I think reaching out to other countries in the global south to find areas of commonality and building those coalitions. So I think that has been broadly India's approach to the international
What really struck me in your answer was that you're trying to focus on renewing the existing institutions, whereas you're trying to build new institutions as well. And the overall discourse is always black and white. That if you're against the old, if you want to have new institutions, by definition you're against the old institutions. Yes. And do you think it's possible to disentangle this in the international level, especially when the press reporting and social media is simplifying everything so narrowly that you cannot have this kind of colorful discussion these days?
I think on that issue it's not as polarized in India. Maybe it is maybe in the US it is more polarized. I think in India there is a view that India has been kept out of a lot of international institutions for a long time for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it was the wrong timing. When the United Nations was formed, India wasn't an independent country, although it was a founding member of the UN. Or in the early 1990s, India simply wasn't powerful enough. When there was an opportunity to reshape some of these international institutions. So in some ways, India's been knocking at the door trying to get in. And it continues to do that, and it continues to put on the table, like at the UN, for example, quite concrete proposals for reform. There are many reasons why that's not happening, but not because of India not wanting it. At the same time, I think there's a realization that India is not going to be invited in all the time for everything. Right. Sometimes yes, to G20, yes, but other things. And so in the meantime, you have to build up parallel institutions, and whether it's regional institutions, whether it is working together on BRICS. I mean, that was at least the initial idea behind BRICS. It has evolved a little bit since then, to something like the International Solar Alliance, which is something that India and France co-founded. So there are a whole bunch of new institutions that India is starting to invest in. But I think largely it is institutions that work, and where can you get the most outcomes from? and not all of them are equal in that respect.
Yeah, that's true. But you also have to search for solutions which serve your national interest and economic interest at the end of the day. So I imagine this is a multi-layered approach that, for certain tasks you have certain institutions like the United Nations, but there are some issues that the UN cannot address, therefore you come up with something else.
Yes, right. And I'll give you an example. Like for a long time, India is still part of an institution which still exists on paper called the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, which includes India and Pakistan. And it's 8 countries, and each one has a veto. And the reality is, because of differences mostly between India and Pakistan, but also some others, not a lot got done. And so for 20, 30 years, India was investing in this institution that nothing was really productively moving. And so while remaining part of that, it still exists, it has a secretariat, India built another institution called BIMSTEC, which includes a smaller group of South Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries, to actually get some of those things done because it was overcoming some of the obstacles of the pre-existing organization. So I think where it's practical, you find a solution.
Coming back to pragmatism, one of the criticisms of the West towards India in the last 4 years has been that it kept engaging Russia on so many dimensions. And this became quite a moral issue for most of the European countries. Whereas on the other hand, India tries to remain pragmatic on that account, and obviously you have to navigate a very delicate neighborhood with China, Russia, and a bunch of other countries in the neighborhood. What is the objective there, and how you can avoid being teamed up, how you can avoid ending up in the wrong company occasionally?
Right, so again, I think each one is pragmatic. India's engagement with China is very different from Russia, right? With China, there's some systemic competition between India and China, but they did find areas of cooperation on economic and trade issues. Even to this day, China is a very large trade partner of India, and initially on some multilateral issues as well. I think the last few years have been a bit more difficult, again, because of the border tensions that led to less cooperation. So I think China was a slightly different, India has a different approach. There's a very close China-Pakistan military relationship, and that has colored India's approach. Russia is different. India doesn't have any intrinsic differences with Russia. There's no competition over, no direct competition. And I think there are 3 aspects to that Russia relationship. One is there's an old defense, mostly defense and strategic technology relationship, which dates back to the Cold War, particularly the last 2 decades of the Cold War. That is changing mostly because of the competitiveness of other systems that are coming on play. So I would say it's declining in importance, but it remains quite important for India. The second is a commodity relationship. Russia remains a big exporter of oil, gas, coal, critical minerals. And so India's wanted to, oil issues become particularly big, but it's actually more comprehensive than that. India needs those raw materials. Russia is one major source of it. And so I think that requires often navigating sanctions regimes and things like that. But insofar as India can do that, it will continue to do that. And the third aspect is a strategic relationship, which is there are concerns about what the China-Russia relationship will mean for everybody else. And for India, having a close partner in Russia and a close competitor, or a serious competitor in China, having perhaps the closest relationship between the two of them since the 1950s, perhaps, is deeply concerning. And so India has sought to engage with Russia to, in some ways, give Moscow options. So I think that is kind of when you explain that, I think, to a lot of European capitals, they're not happy about it, but if you explain what the logic of that relationship is, and that at various points of time it has actually helped Europe as well to have that. Much like I heard the Hungarian foreign minister say something similar, but it was India that was able to communicate certain things to Moscow about nuclear escalation, for example, which I know in Washington they valued. While they were not happy for other reasons about India's relationship with Moscow, they knew that they could have a line of contact that would be helpful in certain ways.
It really struck me that but a significant part of your answer was about China, even though we spoke about Russia. And biggest neighbor, most important competitor, but yet a partner when it comes to the New World Order, BRICS, SCO, and a bunch of other organizations. So how you can understand the relationship, which is built on a certain level of mutual mistrust because of the complicated history you have on the one hand, but also the desire to make the world more effective on the other?
I think, again, India and China have different reasons for being part of the same organization in some ways. So BRICS, I think, started off with a very specific purpose, which is both China, India, along with Russia, Brazil, wanted reform of financial institutions after the global financial crisis. So they had a very singular objective, which is to collectively advocate for that reform. And when that didn't take place, it led to the development of the BRICS New Development Bank. But I think there are also limitations to that, and I spoke about it on our panel, which is, in some ways the common agenda remains for BRICS countries emphasizing their own sovereignty, but with very different, a Brazil and a UAE and a India and China have very different priorities when it comes to what kind of sovereignty they want to emphasize. So I think, again, India is the president of BRICS this year. I think some of the limitations of that organization are also quite apparent. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is another part that India and China are both members. China founded it. India became involved. That's more for engagement with Central Asia. And that for India, that is the real value there. So I think even though they're part of some of the same groupings, India and China have slightly different approaches to that. I mean, one of the internal debates in BRICS is how much to make it a very explicitly anti-Western organization, which China and Russia have been pushing in that direction. Whereas India, Brazil, even the UAE now are more comfortable with having a sort of non-Western but not explicitly anti-Western position on many issues.
So can we say that the India-China relationship is one of the competitive coexistence at the end of the day?
It's competitive. I think right now it has stabilized a little bit in the last year, but I think the concern is that it could always revert to something more competitive. That is the concern. So it is what it is. Yeah. It's for India, I think it's the biggest challenge in some ways.
Yeah. Obviously, China's not going anywhere anytime soon. So on that front, you have to have some kind of a working relationship with them as well. You mentioned sovereignty. And if there is a government in the world these days which have been standing up for sovereignty apart from the Hungarian, obviously, that has been the Indian government. And if I look at your investment strategy, foreign relations, everything else, it really goes back to the national interest. And I dare to say occasionally the shameless representation of the national interest at times, which has been quite unusual for some time. And I remember India getting certain kind of criticisms from the mainstream media that, it's too outspoken, it's too brutal, and so on and so forth when it comes to standing up for its national interest. But this seems to be the norm in 2026.
Right. And I think it's something, again, in a democratic society, people expect of leadership, right? You have to explain to them why does making this trade-off or why does joining this organization, it's very legitimate for taxpayers to say, why is a leader going to this country? And so if you say, well, he's going to promote investments, it resonates, for the security relationship, it resonates positively, I think, with voters as well.
In your assessment, did this bring any results when it comes to securing the neighborhood, securing investment, attracting FDI and other, tangible, measurable outputs?
It's hard to measure. I'd say it has helped investment in the past. We've seen, I'll give some examples. Even when they were recently, India-Canada relations were not great. It's being repaired now. But despite that, we still had Canadian investment coming into India. So I think on the investment front, now we're starting to see on the trade side and investments in manufacturing, particularly after COVID. So I think that has been a very tangible result of that. Security is a bit more difficult because sometimes it's like 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So you have seen, for example, India enter into bilateral agreements with large number of countries, including the US, including Russia recently, to allow Indian military like ships and planes to refuel in those countries' ports. So these reciprocal access agreements. So India has that with Australia, with So you can now see, for example, like the Indian Navy operates from East Africa to the Western Pacific, not because India has permanent military bases in these places, but because of partnerships with many countries. So it's able to conduct anti-piracy operations, secure sea lanes without a permanent presence, but through a network of partnerships. So I think that those are some ways in which that happens. Obviously, I think sometimes it has had, for example, there have been some negative developments also in India's neighborhood, which you also have to mitigate at the same time.
Before I get to the India relationship, which has been quite interesting recently because of the FTA negotiations, you mentioned in the panel that the issue of the global commons is still very important. And if you want to become a pole in the multipolar world, you obviously have to take responsibility for the global commons as well, which is not only talk but action as well. So you have to do anti-piracy operations, you have to provide for peacekeeping missions relations and so on and so forth. Is this something that most of the Indian people can relate to? I mean, obviously you had a very long history in peacekeeping, having been deployed to certain parts of the world, but do they accept this as a cost of being a great power, or is this debate not on the surface yet?
I don't think people think of it in those terms necessarily the way you framed it. I'd say there's some ways where the tangible outcomes seem to be more apparent. Anti-piracy operations is a very easy one because it's in India's near abroad, and India is very dependent on trade from over the ocean. So that's a very easy one. In some ways, it's an extension of its security profile. A second, actually, space is something, for example, where it's very popular. There's an understanding that it actually helps benefit people. It's not just, these are not vanity projects. These are actually, they help farmers. They help with weather forecasting, which have very direct implications on people's lives. So like space management is something that has a lot of popular resonance. Surprisingly, like energy efficiency, things like that. Pollution obviously is a big issue in India. So those are the kinds of ways I think where atmosphere, oceans, space do actually resonate. Some things are a bit more difficult. I'd say like Arctic, Antarctic role. So India does play a role as part of it's an observer at the Arctic Council. It has 2 stations in Antarctica, but that's something that is a bit more remote. So India has a slightly more, at least the Arctic has a bit more of a dispassionate or distant view to it. But now I think there's an understanding that even there, India will have some role to play. Part again of that entering into that agreement with Russia, part of the logic is that allows Indian vessels to traverse the Arctic as well, potentially.
What would that bring to India? Sorry for the blunt.
No. So a few things. I think critical mineral exploitation, trading routes. So again, if you have a northern passage that actually enables access to some scientific research as well. So I think a combination of those factors. It's more important for China just because of geography. It matters more, but India is engaged on the Arctic as well.
Well, I guess sitting around the table doesn't hurt for sure. So.
And again, a lot of India's close partners, the U.S., Canada, the Nordic countries, Russia, happen to be Arctic states as well.
Yeah, so. That's also true. Yeah. So EU-India, the FTA negotiations have been closed for what I've seen. So
I think they were announced.
Even though maybe some details are still a little bit unclear. What are the expectations on the Indian side when it comes to what you can get out of this relationship?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is access to a very large market. One of the 3 larger, US, China, Europe still remain the 3 largest markets. I think providing some regulatory clarity for both Indian investors in Europe and European investors in India.
Has this been an issue recently?
In the past, it has been an issue. And we had some differences, for example, over a carbon border adjustment mechanism. For example, India is a big steel exporter. That's one, not the only sector that was being affected, but certainly one of many. So I think there were those concerns. Some things were set aside. Agriculture, for example, by and large, was set aside. We'll have to see what the digital provisions are. But India recently did an agreement with the UK, which had quite ambitious regulatory provisions on the digital side, which again will help companies in both countries operating in each other's jurisdictions. So I think it has very transformative potential. But the biggest thing is I think it brings stability and clarity to European businesses wanting to do more in India and Indian businesses wanting to do more in Europe, which will benefit both.
How would that apply to the intra-Indian regulatory framework, if I may ask that question? Because when I've been there, everybody is telling me that even in the different states, it's somewhat different.
So that's very true. And there's actually quite a lot of competition amongst the Indian states for investment. Everyone says invest here, not there. And state level politics in India is in some ways even more competitive and more than national politics. But they've actually taken steps now to reform a lot of that. The biggest one being something called the Goods and Services Tax, GST, which basically created sort of national VAT. That was done a few years ago, and then it became a bit unnecessarily complicated. It has now been sort of simplified in some ways to allow for more interstate commerce. So that's been a big change, and it's made things a lot easier for businesses, foreign businesses wanting to operate in multiple jurisdictions in India.
Yeah, I think that helps everybody who wants to invest in India, that if the regulatory framework is somewhat synchronized across all the states. Last question, the big one, United States, obviously. The relationship between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump has been quite exciting, to say the least, with occasional grace periods and occasional tariffs coming in here and then. You're a member of Quad. Obviously, you have a security cooperation. On the other hand, that amount of unpredictability that has been emanating out of Washington recently makes everybody a little bit uneasy. How you can navigate this kind of uncertainty?
So, look, the United States is India's most important part, in terms of comprehensive partnership.
Right.
Yes. So, like every issue, from energy to technology to defense to trade, is affected in the India-U.S. relationship. So it's important for India to get it right. You know, if we'd had this conversation a year ago, I would have said India is one of the few relationships that improved from Clinton to Bush, to Obama, to Trump, to Biden, and then to Trump again, right? One of the few relationships that was reasonably steady, not without difficulties, but with reasonably steady. The last year, then we saw a downturn after May of last year, which has now been somewhat fixed with the trade agreement, which is being finalized now. And so hopefully that means we can get back to normal. But even in this very difficult period over the past year, you actually had a renewal of a US-India defense agreement in last September. We had military exercises with all three military services between the US and India. You had India procuring some defense equipment from the US. You had AI investments in India. You had a big energy deal at the end of last year. So again, even when things are bad, that shows you that there's still an underlying logic. What has been affected, apart from trade, was really the political level engagement. Now there's been a sort of restart of that since really September of last year. So we can sort of move back towards that. On the Quad specifically, again, some of the working level cooperation continued. The military side remained. The problem is we hadn't had a Quad summit for some time. And now there's some room now to maybe, India's supposed to host the next one. It's been for 2 years now postponed. That may restart again, which will enable a certain pretty things that require a presidential level mandate.
And everybody had elections in the meantime.
Everyone had elections. So I think that there's keenness to bring that back. I think they'll try and schedule it, hopefully at the end of this, by the end of this year. So that'll continue. Yeah.
So even there, we have to focus more on the substance than the optics, right?
Yeah, I think but I think the question is, how do you look? The U.S. is undergoing its own churn. Again, I mentioned this on our panel. Not just between Republicans and Democrats, very polarized, but even within each party, there is a lot of churn. In some ways, on some issues, international issues, the left wing of the Democratic Party and the right wing of the Republican Party actually have more in common with each other. So there's a lot of churn happening in the U.S. It's of interest to the rest of us in the world because it affects all of us. And I think the question for India is how do you navigate that? You can't. Americans are going to make decisions based on what they see as their national interest. But where can you find commonality? How can you maximize the positives and mitigate the negatives? And there are always going to be positives and negatives in that relationship.
Yeah, of course. But at the end of the day, even U.S. foreign policy is defined by the needs of the American people,
course,
just
absolutely.
as your foreign policy is defined
so where
by
do you
the
find
Indian people?
So if that is the premise, publicly people talk about sort of common values, all of that, all good. We all like that. But the reality is, where can you find commonality? It's completely understandable for Americans to say we want balanced trade with the world, right? So for India, it's like, obviously we have a trade surplus with the U.S., so quite a big one. India said, look, we're willing to buy. There are a few items we need from you. We're willing to try and work with you to try and balance that trade. And in civil aviation, defense, energy, there are certain things that semiconductors, India does need that quite urgently. So we'll work with you to try and balance that, and we want to sustain that relationship.
Yeah, I think on that note, we can finish the conversation, but it's really good to have these engagements where you come to the bottom line that at the end of the day, it's really the people that matters.
Yeah, of course,
and pragmatism. All right, thanks a lot for coming to Budapest, and hope you'll have a good time later today.
Thank you.
Thank you.